All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Let us continue today, finish the ethical relativism. But first, let's review. What is relativism? Will depend on something else, right? Because relativism can be of two types: cultural and individual. So depending on that, then it would be either depending on different cultures or depending on the individual point of view. But overall, the definition is relativism means that our judgments about ethics are relative to or dependent on something else. Okay, now what is the difference between cultural and individual? Well, kind of already said it, right? Depends on culture, depends on individual. There's obviously a difference between those two. What is the difference between descriptive and meta-ethical relativism? Well, if you again use the word describes, if it describes, it's descriptive. No, in terms of the descriptive, it just tells you that this is what is happening. People have different views, right? It's just a factual claim. The fact is, there's relativism. People have different cultural and individual views. Meta-ethical is more of a judgment about that. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? So meta-ethical relativism would, of course, be saying that it is a good thing, that that's how things should be. There should not be any overwhelming morality because it's all subjective. It depends on individuals or cultures. Okay, now nihilism. What is nihilism? Yeah, that the ethical values, objective ethical values, do not exist. And objectivism would be, well, it's rather obvious from this. Objectivism is opposite of that, right? It says that objective values do exist. Ethical objectivism. And then perspectivism. But just like the word suggests. Yeah, well, there's no actual values per se. There's just different perspectives. And finally, pragmatism, the American contribution to philosophy. What is pragmatism? Again, the word itself tells you, what does it emphasize? Practical approach to values. Like basically, it's just that application. It tells you that from practical point of view, whatever works is valuable, right? If it serves our practical purposes, that means it is valuable. Okay, so let's go back to this. Why do people support ethical relativism? And we saw it already last time when we discussed it, but now it's just summary of that, I guess. First of all, people say there is a diversity of moral views. That's a descriptive claim, but nonetheless, it seems like that if different people and different cultures do have different views, maybe that does support the fact that there is no one view for everyone. The other reason is we want to be tolerant, open-minded, and culturally competent. We want to avoid ethnocentrism, the idea that our culture is the only correct one. That's the culture, the way things should be is the way we do things. And relativism seems to support avoiding ethnocentrism. Cultural competence, the desire to understand and relate to cultural values of other people. So again, if you want to be sensitive about other cultures, it seems like you need to be relativist. By the way, we will go into criticism of all this in a second. This is just all the reasons why people do support it. The third reason, there truly is moral uncertainty. There's a good example Sartre presents in one of his works. We can come back to it later, but well, may as well mention it now. So Sartre says, one of my students came to me, and that was during World War II. One of my students came to me and asked, I have the following dilemma. My mother is gravely ill, and I need to take care of my mother. But I also want to go to the front and fight the Nazis. And I feel like for my country, that is my duty. What should I do? Should I abandon my sick mother and go fight for the country? Or should I stay with my sick mother and then not fight the Nazis at the front? So that's kind of an example, right? That moral uncertainty could create the problem. Whether there is an answer to this, we will discuss in more detail, but the idea then is, well, if that is the situation, then relativism makes sense because it's all relative. And finally, people in situations differ across time and space. So somebody can say, because things are so different across cultures, we conclude there is no objective moral values. Okay, so let's start thinking about them and see if we can criticize these reasons. First, let's start with diversity of moral views. How diverse really are they? How deep are the disagreements? Now, there are some extreme cases we have mentioned before regarding the people strangling their grandmothers and so on when they are too old. But this is, of course, exception. For the most part, do people really disagree about things like this? The majority of people not sure whether they should strangle their grandma or not. No, it is fairly rare. In reality, disagreements are more often about the facts rather than about the beliefs. More often than not, disagreements are not so much about values, but about facts. Remember, we distinguished values and facts before. So in that case, there is a good table here. We may disagree about certain value, right? We ought not to harm the environment. But the factual disagreement would be, is CO2 emissions harm the environment or not? And that's a factual disagreement. Some people may say they do not really harm the environment. So they are not objecting to the moral principle that the environment should not be harmed. They are objecting to the factual claim that, in fact, CO2 emissions harm it. And of course, depending on that, then the conclusion could be different. Some people will say we ought to reduce emissions. Other people say we need not to reduce emissions. But in terms of value, they're really not disagreeing. Another example the book gives of what could raise disagreement, they asked students, when did George Washington die? Like, I don't know if you guys read it, but if you read the chapter, you know, because they actually give you the answer. But for the most people, if you ask them on the street or somewhere, well, they can give you a ballpark, right? They're not going to most likely give you the precise date. Some of them will say that was probably somewhere before 1800. Other people may be less sure. Somebody may ask, who is George Washington? Right? But in the end of the day, they will have different views on it. But does that mean that we don't have any way to find out that this is relative? No, of course not. George Washington has a particular date of when he died, and you can Google it and find out. And this is not relative. But people may, in fact, even disagree based on bad information. Somebody can say it was 1799, the other person can say 1798, and that would not be really like, oh, for me it's 79, and for you it is 78 or something. No, it is still, there is still the fact of when he died. It's just people may not know it very well. Then the tolerance, open-mindedness, and cultural competence. That one is a little trickier because, yeah, we want to respect other cultures, but as we already mentioned before, there certainly are limits there. The paradox of toleration and the question of whether you should be tolerant of the intolerant, whether you should be tolerant of people who have these oppressive cultures, and that obviously is as tricky as it is. It seems like we shouldn't go too crazy with toleration. There are several examples here from the book. There are readings at the end there also from Louis Pochman, who says relativism implies that we cannot critique cultures and cultural practices that are obviously wrong. And it does seem like there are some cultural practices which are obviously wrong. Even if you don't believe that there is some sort of absolutely objective values, the way Plato thought, you may still say that, well, certain practices like violating female rights, suppressing women, and so on, they seem to be wrong, and we should be able to criticize them. We cannot just take a position, well, what if it's good for you, that's all that matters. Because it does seem like there's something wrong with it. Then moral uncertainty and relativism. Sometimes judging an issue is a matter of skepticism rather than relativism. And that is another thing. Like, just because we cannot know something doesn't mean that it is not, cannot be true. Right? So moral uncertainty is a suspension of judgment. Being uncertain does not imply relativism. Skepticism is a view that it is difficult, if not impossible, to know something. So we may not know the correct answer to a certain question, but that doesn't mean that there is no correct answer. Then situational differences in relativism. Yeah, there are different situations. Obviously, health, is it value or not? Well, depending on the situation, there is, I think the table is a little bit further. There's an example actually from the Plato's Republic. If you did the reading at the very beginning of book 1. Now, what was the definition of justice the old man Cephalus presented, and what did Socrates object to it? The very first definition. They had several definitions there as they went along. So what he actually, the definition is actually there on the slide, right? Yeah, he already put it there. The definition was given to each his or her due. So did you do the reading? What is happening at the beginning? It's a great example for especially what we are discussing now, and we will even still discuss it in chapter 4. So you really should do the reading, but so nobody knows. How does it start? Socrates is talking to an old man Cephalus. And what is he asking? Saying, you're about to die. Do you have any advice? How are you feeling about being so old? And the old man Cephalus says, no, I actually am fine with it because I was just my entire life. I have no problem going to the other world. And Socrates says, oh really? So what exactly is justice to you? And he says, well, given to each his or her own due. And Socrates objects to that in the following way. So he says, okay, but he clarifies it by saying, I do not have any debts. Anything I ever took from anybody, I gave them back. So that would be like giving them whatever is due to them. And Socrates says, okay, let's say the person is insane. They gave you a knife and then they became insane. Would you give them the knife back? So that was the question, like that situational differences, right? Giving back whatever you borrowed is a rather abstract principle, but once you start applying it, in some cases it may not be very applicable. Like in the case when somebody is borrowing the knife or a weapon while they maybe still fine, and then becoming insane. Okay, here's your weapon, which I borrowed from you. No, it seems like that it's more tricky than that. Anyway, we're not going to talk about it just yet, but this is just a good example. Then situational moral objectivism is not the same thing as absolutism. Absolutism would be this view, that very inflexible view, that moral rules or principles have no exceptions and are context independent. Like stealing is always wrong no matter what. No exception. Any stealing is wrong. Now, on the other hand, that is not the same thing as objectivism, which is to say that what is good for concrete case may vary from person to person. There is such thing that general principle stealing is bad, but you have to be flexible in terms of application, just like giving back what you borrowed may be a general principle, but in some applications it may not be applicable. And that doesn't mean that there's no objective value. It just means that you should not be so stubborn in terms of absolute application. We will come back to it when we get to more application of all this theory. So is relativism self-contradictory? That is what sometimes has been said. In fact, Plato in one of the dialogues says that if you honestly advance the position that all points of view are equal and they by themselves don't have any value, then how about your own position about relativism? That seems like you are self-defeating, right? You are saying that my position also has no value, so why should anybody listen to you then? So, well, that may be a little bit of a simplification. This is a good quote from Rorty. He attacking this. He's saying relativism is the view that every belief on a certain topic, or perhaps about any topic, is as good as any other. But no one holds this view. Except for the occasional cooperative freshman, one cannot find anybody who says that two incompatible opinions on important topic are equally good. The philosophers who get called relativists are those who say that the grounds for choosing between such options are less algorithmic than had previously been thought. And actually, if you read Nietzsche carefully, Nietzsche also holds this position, right? He does say that there is a definitely better and worse points of view. It's just that for him, if it's more, as he calls it, life-affirming, then it is better. What exactly is life-affirming? Well, you can suggest different things. He's saying, if you can come up with something better than me, I'll agree with you. But it's not saying that there's literally all opinions on everything are equal. It is indeed unsustainable point of view. Nobody ever even holds it. People do think that their opinion is more valuable, which is why they hold it in the first place. So Rorty himself described his approach as pragmatism or anti-foundationalism. So this is also a continuation of this pragmatic line by William James and other pragmatists. He means that we find ourselves in the middle of things without access to any final account of ultimate reality or absolute values. For pragmatists, our judgments about things, including our judgments about ideas such as relativism, are provisional and embedded in context, cultures, and ways of life. Different groups to which I belong may have different moral views. So you see, again, coming back to this Sartre example, this is the two different points of view. Like, what is more important, your family or your country? Like his grandma, that's his family. Should he prioritize his grandma because as her grandson, he is responsible for her? But at the same time, he also is a citizen. And his country has been attacked by the Nazis, so he has responsibility as a citizen. And this is not in itself relativism. It's just the reality of life that we do have different roles. Nobody has just one role in life as, I don't know, like when you talk, for example, about men and women. Well, men and women also may have other different affiliations, like they could be different color for one thing, right? Different social and economic status, and so on. And so that is never as simple. And the question here is, how do I feel versus how am I ought to feel? That's also an interesting thing. Because when you try to figure out what is the best way to do, most moral way to do it, it's actually difficult to figure out what exactly are you feeling in the first place and how does it influence you. I had an interesting dilemma myself. I can tell you my example because I was thinking a lot about it. So here's the situation. My cat was dying. He had kidney problem. I loved this cat absolutely dearly, and I didn't want him to die, obviously. Right? So I took him to the vet, and the vet said the best thing to do is to euthanize him. Right? Because otherwise he will die anyway. It's stage 4 kidney disease. There's no cure. The only thing other thing which could theoretically be done in some cases is kidney implant, which cost like $30,000. And given his age, he was 13 years old, that is not going to be advisable because he's most likely going to die during this operation and you're still going to pay $30,000. And if he survives, that will give him maybe a year for $30,000. And I'm not a millionaire, you know, right? But at the same time, I was also thinking, well, can I just euthanize him? Because if it comes to pets, we do it so easily. But for human being, would you ever euthanize a human being like, oh, he's suffering, let's just put him down? It seems like a very hard decision to make. And I read on the internet, and some people were saying, oh, don't listen to the doomsday doctors. You can also actually treat them. They have the liquid infusion. If you do that, they can live several months or maybe another year, and it's not as expensive. So I took him back to the vet, and I said, let's do this. It was like $1,000. So I was like, I'm going to pay $1,000. Let's do this. And they were like, well, it's probably not going to help, and it's not going to. But I still insisted on that because I wanted him to get better, right? Okay, so he was there for 3 days. They did that. I came to pick him up. Oh my God, my heart just sank because he was so much worse. Like he died within 24 hours after I brought him home. Died himself. And I felt terrible about the whole thing. And like I still feel terrible. And I was trying to understand what was my motivation. Was I genuinely trying to take care of him? Or was I just trying to make myself feel better? Because for one thing, I feel better when my cat is around. He was so, nice and cuddly, and he would make me, feel better about myself too. And it's like, was I being selfish? Should I have euthanized him? What was my I don't know. I honestly, I was really trying to parse my brain over this issue. It's impossible. Your motivations are not clear even to you. Right? In a situation like this, you cannot be sure. Why are you doing this? It's just like there's so many factors of information too. Like I said, the Google was telling me one thing, the doctor was saying the other. I was like, is doctor right? Should I listen to the doctor? But then these people on the Google, they are saying well, it's not Google, but there was this lady has a whole website. I Googled it, but I found it. And she was describing a story with her own cats and how she went through the same thing and giving advice. So yeah, the point of this story is it's really difficult to say. We do have feelings, of course, but even these feelings may be contradictory. And then, I still feel completely guilty about the whole thing. Because I still, with hindsight, I know I should have just euthanized him. That would have been better. He suffered several unnecessary days and died probably much worse than he would have died if he was euthanized. But I couldn't know that. For all I knew, maybe he would have lived another year. Maybe it would have helped. Right? So, anyway. And then moral realism. Realism in general is the view that there exists a reality independent of those who know it. For example, most of us think that external world is real, independently of whether we are aware of it or not. So if the tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? Most of us would say, yeah, it does make some waves in the air. Whether somebody hears it or not, that's a different question. So moral realism is the view that there are objective moral values that exist independently of knowers, like goodness and so on. Now, that will bring us back to Plato, of course, because that's what Plato thought. Moral pluralism, on the other hand, is the idea that there are a variety of equally valid moral principles or equal moral values. For example, autonomy, justice, well-being, authenticity are all equally valuable. So if you have to choose between them, obviously that may be difficult. If you have a situation where you are stuck between justice and autonomy or justice and well-being, and you have to pick either one or the other, which one do you pick? So the moral pluralism will tell you that, well, there's no one correct answer. If you can advance one of them, that's great. But if they start conflicting, then it is a difficult situation. So moral pluralism emphasizes that humans are diverse and should be allowed to flourish in their own way too. John Locke, in the reading, which that actually added to the chapter there, says, sanity and toleration demand that we allow each person to pursue his own, possibly unique form of fulfillment. Martin Nussbaum, again, has this capabilities approach. Ross gives us this prima facie duties: fidelity, reparation, gratitude, beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and self-improvement. So he says this is some of the duties we all have, and they are kind of ranked in this way. Now let's go back to the reading now. So did anybody do the reading? Did anybody do the Plato reading? By the way, book 1 is kind of early work. It probably was written shortly after Socrates died, and it's more faithful to the way Socrates truly was, because he is just asking questions there. He mostly just asking questions, right? So the subject is justice. We already kind of started on that. He was talking first to this old man Cephalus. Old man Cephalus probably didn't want to argue, so he very quickly retreats, and his nephew, I think it was his nephew, Polemarchus, steps in and starts talking to Socrates about what is justice. And he does, again, bring this definition, that justice is giving each its due. That's the way Greeks always looked at it. It's actually a classical definition. Homer has it too. So basically, treat your friends and family good and treat enemies badly. And what does Socrates say to that? Does he agree with this? No, he disagrees with it. Why? What is he saying? Well, he doesn't phrase it this way, because in book 1 he's just asking questions, but he disagrees with you should treat anybody badly. So you should treat everybody well, including your enemies. Which, by the way, later is what Christ was saying. Some people compare Socrates to Christ in the sense that both of them died horribly for what they believed, and both of them preached similar things. Okay, so this is what is happening in book 1. They continue this conversation, and then, well, let's just go through it. It's on the slides. So Socrates says justice is not simply a matter of being truthful and returning what one owes. This is when he says you can't return a knife to an insane person. Polemarchus then steps in and says justice is a matter of giving what is appropriate to each person. To friends, giving good; to enemies, giving bad. Socrates asks, well, who are your friends and enemies? That's another Socratic way to do it. Do you always know who's your friend and your enemy? So if you treat somebody badly, may it turn out that it actually is your friend, and you're treating your friend badly. And if you treating somebody well, may it not turn out that it is your enemy, and you treated your enemy badly. And then he says that you shouldn't treat anybody badly. And then Thrasymachus steps in. Thrasymachus is actually a famous sophist. One of the sophists. Remember those people who are more cynical and approach life with a relativist point of view. And he says this: justice is what is good for the stronger. He actually, in the book, he is very kind of vocal about it. He goes, oh, what is all this nonsense, Socrates? You always ask this stupid question, you idiot. You just confuse everybody. Just stop with this trickery. It's simple. Justice is whatever is good for the stronger. Whoever has the power, if you do just things, you are working in their benefit. So then Socrates again tries to kind of catch him, and he says, okay, so justice means doing what is in the interest of those in power then, the strong people. And Thrasymachus says, yeah, that's what it is. So note that his actual point is that when you obey the laws are set by people in power, and that is typically what we think about being just, obeying the laws. In Greek it was actually more obvious even than in English, but even in English the word justice and just are related, right? And justice is what? Court of law. So Socrates says, okay, so to be just then is to obey the laws of those in power. And that serves their interest. But then those in power do make mistakes, don't they? Sometimes they may pass a law which does not support their interest. And Thrasymachus agrees to this. He says, yeah, I guess sometimes the laws don't really serve their interest. And then Socrates says, well, then we have a contradiction. So those in power may mistakenly make laws that are not in their interest. To obey such laws is not to act in the interest of those in power, but in the same time it is to act in the interest of those in power. Well, did you get that far? What was the Thrasymachus' response to that? He actually kind of very skillfully avoided this problem. He said, well, if they are passing the laws which are not in their interest, then they are not really strong. It's not a true tyrant who passes the law which goes against his interest. So this is the idea of like who is truly a powerful person, and if somebody is doing that, they are truly not. They are weak. Okay, so injustice. Now the Socrates actually brings another good point out about justice. He's saying this: if a group of unjust people try to accomplish something, and they are unjust to each other, would they be able to accomplish that? So let's say gangsters want to rob a bank. Can they be unjust to each other? No, that's not going to work. That's the point. They may be unjust to the bank, but they have to be at the very least just to each other. So that's how Socrates kind of proves his point. He says that's why injustice is not good. You may get some temporary advantage, but if you want to achieve something, you have to be just. The book 1, though, ends at this point. But then the book 2, which was probably written later, is more interesting. And book 2 kind of is something we already can use for chapter 4, which is the next chapter on altruism and so on. So book 2, first of all, Thrasymachus at this point actually doesn't talk anymore. He is kind of just annoyed and saying, whatever you want, Socrates, I don't care. I'm not going to argue anymore. He's like one of those people who stop the argument on Facebook and just ban you. Right? He didn't ban Socrates or block him, but just stop talking. But one of the other guys, Glaucon, who actually is friendly to Socrates, says, okay, Socrates, but you have to really prove to us that justice is a good thing. And he says, first of all, there are 3 different types of things. Right? Things which are good by themselves, but not for their consequences. Like enjoying the sunset or something. Right? It's pleasant, but it doesn't really give you anything long term. Then he says there are different type of goods which are good both themselves, pleasant, and consequences. Example would be obtaining knowledge. It's a pleasant process to obtain knowledge, and it also has positive consequences. And then there is third type of thing which are not pleasant, not good themselves. So example for us would be a good example, going to the dentist. Is that pleasant? Are you enjoying it? Anybody here? No, nobody enjoys. So why are we going? Consequences. Later on it saves us more pain. Okay, so he asks Socrates then, which one do you think justice is? And he's saying most people would think it's number 3. It's like going to a dentist. Justice by itself is not pleasant, but why do we do that? We want other people to be just to us. So basically the idea is, if I could be unjust to other people and have no consequences, I gladly would do so. It's just that there are consequences. Well, the most obvious one, I can go to jail, right? So that's how most people think. And Socrates says, no, justice is number 2. It's both good in itself and the consequences. So not only does it give you good consequences because other people see you being just and treat you accordingly, but it is good for you. And then the entire republic is an attempt to actually prove it. Did anybody read about the ring of judges? Ring of judges. This is actually in the book reading for chapter 4, but we may as well talk about it now. So here's the story. That's what Glaucon tells Socrates. He says there was this guy Gyges, and once he was walking and there was a crack in the earth. So he goes into this crack, there is the bronze horse there, and a dead person inside this horse. And the dead person had a ring. And the judges took this ring, didn't think much about it, put it on his finger, and went to have some sort of gathering, to a gathering with other shepherds. While he was listening to them, he was twisting the ring mindlessly. And then he noticed that they suddenly started talking about him as if he was not there. And he realized that when he turns the ring, he becomes invisible. And when he turns it back, they can see him again. So Gyges took it to his advantage. He immediately went on and joined the court of the king, somehow managed to seduce the king's wife, murder the king, and become the king himself. How did he do it being invisible is not explained in the story. It is a little bit strange, but the moral of it is this. He was able to get away with many things because if you are invisible, you can do things and nobody knows you're doing them. You certainly can steal stuff, right? People wouldn't understand, like, where did it go, but nobody could see you. You could harm other people without them noticing you, and so on. So that's the point Glaucon trying to make. Most people see justice exactly like that. You are just to other people because you're not invisible. But if you could be invisible, if you could get away with it, majority, if not all the people, would certainly do horrible things. And he asks Socrates to prove to them that that's not the case, that justice is good in itself. So this is the three choices, right? The things good for their own sake, things good for their own sake and the consequences, and some burdensome things which are only good for their consequences. Ring, Gyges of Lydia, that we already talked about. And then he says, okay, let's look at 2 people. One of them is perfectly just, the other one is perfectly unjust. The perfectly unjust person gets away with everything. He is never caught in his injustice. People don't know he is unjust. People think he is just. He is very convincing. He acquires lots of friends and a lot of wealth. He acquires state power, becomes a tyrant or something, right? Marries whoever he wants. Good to friends, bad to enemies, It even pleases the gods, because if you have money, and especially the way Greeks looked at it, you can give sacrifices to the gods, and gods will be happy too. So unlike Christians, they didn't believe that in afterlife you're necessarily going to be responsible, especially if you manage to please the gods. And perfectly just person is the opposite. He is perfectly just, but he has really bad reputation. Nobody even knows he is just. For whatever reason, people think he is unjust. They punish him. He gets whipped, put on a rack, in chains. Then his eyes are burned out. He's crucified and dies horrible death. And they say, Socrates, prove to us that somehow it's better to be this just person, even though his life is horrible and he dies to horrible death, than the unjust person who has everything he wants. Can you prove it to us? And at that point, this is when, interestingly enough, Socrates says, okay, well, if we want to talk about justice in a person, we have to start talking about justice in the city. Why do you think he said that? Determine who is just and unjust? What do you mean by determine? Like judge them or make them? Okay, yeah, that may be closer to it, because the idea is that, of course, when we are born, little babies, we don't know what justice is. We don't even know the word. But then we grow up among other people, and this is where we get our idea of justice. So that could be one reason. It's actually, there's no clear answer. But yeah, this is the challenge. There's two guys, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are talking to Plato. Adeimantus at this point says, so please don't just demonstrate to us by argument that justice is something more powerful than injustice. Tell us the effect each one of them has just by itself on the person possessing it, whether or not gods and men know about it. The effect which makes one of them good and the other bad. And yeah, the entire Republic is about it. Plato takes several different approaches. He, like I said, immediately starts talking about the city, justice in the state. Well, I already asked that. So justice in the state, he says, the city is like individual written large. So it's easier to see in the city what is justice. And what exactly is he going to come up with there? It's impossible to live a good life and to be a fulfilled individual apart from the state. All the Greeks believed in it. When we're going to talk about Aristotle, I think it is chapter 8, Aristotle actually was a student of Plato. So even though he disagreed with Plato about many things, but this thing he definitely agreed with Plato. You cannot be a fulfilled individual without a state. A good society is only possible if people in power are good and live by the light of philosophical reason. So let's look at his Republic. This is what he was kind of presenting as an example of the most just state. He was saying that, first of all, there should be a division in labor. Division amongst the people. He says some people are good at shoemaking. Who should they be? Shoemakers. Other people are good at growing crops. Well, they should be crop growing. But interestingly enough, he says people don't need very much. So if they are satisfied with just the minimum, that's all they really need. But Glaucon and Adeimantus immediately say, but no, well, this is kind of like the pig life. We want some luxuries. We want some nice things. And he's saying, well, if you want the nice things, then you will need the guardians who will protect you. Because if you have good things, others will want to come and take them. And you need to be protected. So that's basically where he divides them into two groups, but one group has kind of two groups within it. First is producers or laborers. This is majority of people, and they are the ones who just provide necessities for life. This is, you may say, like all the normal business people, workers, and so on. And then there are guardians. And the guardians, according to him, are very different. They are the ones who provide protections, and this is among the guardians that rulers can be selected. It's the best of the guardians. So auxiliaries were a type of the guardians, serving like police, military, government type of role. And the guardians themselves, the rulers, are ultimate rulers of the state. However, one important thing, he says, there should be a full social mobility. In other words, nobody is born producer, nobody is born guardian. If you are better at being a guardian, even though your parents are producers, let's say they are farmers, you should become a guardian. If you are better at being a producer, even if your parents are rulers or guardians, then you should be a ruler. But how can you achieve that? Well, he suggests an interesting thing there. He says they should have common property, common wives, and common children. In fact, children should be taken away from them immediately as soon as they are born and live in a collective type of environment where they would not even know who are their parents. And parents shouldn't know who are their children. And guardians especially shouldn't even have their own property. Why do you think he was doing that? One thing, to take them away from the family so that the family would not have influence over who they grow up, how they grow up, and so on. Because remember that we already mentioned that the big problem in any society is your parents always want the best for you. But if your parents are billionaires or wealthy people, they can indeed give you outstanding education. They give you a loan of $1 million or something to start your own business. And then if your parents are, let's say, drug addicts and criminals, what are they going to give you? Most likely nothing. You're lucky if they're not going to get you involved in some criminal enterprise. So start in life, if the start in life is so different, the result will be different. For a person who are born in a ghetto and his parents or her parents are gangsters, they'd be lucky to make it to a mid-level management at McDonald's. That's already going to be quite an achievement. With the same amount of effort, a person who is a son or a daughter of billionaires can probably become billionaires themselves. How hard is it if your daddy gives you $1 million loan? You have to be really stupid to screw that, and even then your daddy can probably give you another $1 million. So you see that is certainly a problem which we have, and Plato thinks the great idea to solve it is to take away the children from their parents. But is it realistic? Now, that's the problem. And in case you're curious, after the revolution in Russia in 1917, there were ideas like this. Some of the Bolsheviks were suggesting, Trotsky in particular, that all the children should be taken away from their parents and grow up in a huge collective. But it was never even attempted. Why? Well, who would enforce it? How would you even do that? Like, parents, you have a child, you would come and take it away? What parents would allow that? And some of the parents themselves were, party leadership. How about their children? Would they give it up? Who's going to take that away? So they were kind of discussing it as like, oh, it would be nice to do that. They never even tried. Common property, that's another interesting idea. So that's actually kind of socialism, right? He says they should have all common property, everything. According to him, they should even have common pants, right? You wake up in the morning, take any pants you want, and you put them on. Why? In terms of equality, he's saying the big danger is, especially for guardians, if they start acquiring goods. The producers, fine. Producers, he kind of thinks, well, they are like this, so it doesn't matter for them. But for guardians, who are military, police, and so on, who basically have all the power in the city, if they start acquiring money, if they start acquiring goods, that could be a collapse. And he, in the end, actually says how this ideal republic will collapse. But interestingly also, he was very revolutionary for his time. He suggests that women should have equal role. He's saying if a woman can be a guardian, by all means, there should be no restriction. If a woman can be a ruler, no problem. He's saying it should be all merit-based. Whoever is the best at what they're doing, that person should be whatever it is they're capable of. Okay, well, we already discussed it, but what do you think about justice of this society? Would it be just? He's trying to solve exactly that, but here's another problem now. How about the justice to parents who have children? Like, is it just to take away your child and not let you give them all the love and everything you can, right? If you are yourself deserved whatever you have, if you became, I don't know, a famous football player, whatever, and you earned all this stuff, shouldn't you be allowed to give it to your child? Shouldn't it be like, is it just to not let you do that? It seems like that's kind of not just. It's like, it's not even just with children. Like, if I earned my money the fair way, can I not give it to somebody myself, to whoever I want, be it my child or another person? Because that seems like also part of the justice, right? And if we preclude people from doing that, it seems like we are violating justice in relation to them. It may be more even just indeed to the children, although that's debatable too. But how about the parents? Is it fair to the parents? Is it just to the parents? And again, it kind of shows you that when you deal with justice, there's like all these conflicting interests, and it seems like when we try to serve one of them, the other one may be hurt. It's not as easy as having some absolutist rule for everybody. Yeah, let's just do this. And again, revolutionaries in many countries, including Russia, found that out very quickly, because it's fantastic. You have all these great ideas. Then you start implementing them, all sorts of problems pop up. Because in reality, people are far from ideal. And the way then this ideal state shapes up in reality is far from what you envisioned when you were drafting it on paper. Now, whether Plato actually ever meant this state literally is hard to say. Some scholars suggest that he never really thinks that the state like this can even exist, even though he says that he does. And one more important thing he mentions, the rulers should be philosophers, philosopher kings. So how do they get selected? The best among the guardians, then when they reach, like, I forgot, 50 years old or something, could become rulers. He doesn't say there should be one ruler. He says there should be a group of them, group of people who rule the entire society, and they should be philosophers. Why philosophers? This is a quote, actually. He says, unless either philosophers become kings in their countries, or those who are now called kings and rulers come to be sufficiently inspired with a genuine desire for wisdom, unless, that is to say, political power and philosophy meet together, there can be no rest from troubles for states, nor yet, as I believe, for the mankind. Nor can this commonwealth, which we have imagined, ever till then see the light of day and grow to its full stature. So, philosopher kings. By philosopher, of course, he means people who love wisdom. People who are not doing it for power or for the money or for anything else. The only thing they should be concerned with is universal good. And he is very adamant about that they should not have, again, any property themselves, because once they start acquiring property, that can go downhill. And when he is asked in the Republic, does such community exist anywhere? This is his answer. He says, no, but perhaps there is a pattern set up in heavens for one who desires to see it, and seeing it to found one in himself. But whether it exists anywhere or ever will exist is no matter, for this is the only commonwealth in whose politics he can never part. So found one in himself. So that could actually suggest that he means that should be within you rather than the organization of society. And then he does kind of connect that, the idea to justice, to an individual soul. He says, first of all, there are several moral virtues, according to Plato. Wisdom, courage, self-discipline, and justice. Many Greeks were actually agreeing with that. That was not unique to him. Wisdom is when reason possesses knowledge. But that's not enough. Courage is another important part, and that's kind of a spirited part of the soul, should be subordinated to the guidance of reason. So that when you are being courageous, you are not being stupid. Self-discipline is another important part. That's like the appetitive part, as they called it, the one which gives us all the desires for sex and bodily pleasures and so on, should be subordinated to courage and to wisdom. And justice, according to Plato, is when all these elements are in correct balance. So neither of them overcomes the other ones. A good action, as a result, would be the one which tends to subdue the brutish parts of our nature to the human, perhaps rather say to the divine in us. And evil actions enslave humanity to the savagery of the beast. The sweetest will belong to that part of the soul whereby we gain understanding and knowledge, and the man in whom that part predominates will have the pleasantest life. So the answer he seemed to suggest is take care of your soul. That's how it benefits you yourself, right? It's not so much about what others think of you, but what you think about yourself. Even if you gain all the money and power and everything, and nobody ever finds out about the horrible things you did, you damaged your soul. You yourself damaged yourself, and that will always be with you. People think that all the luxury and wealth and power in the world cannot make life more worth living when the bodily constitution is going to wreck and ruin, right? When somebody is sick and dying, does it help them much that they have millions of dollars? Probably not. If they truly are dying, if their body is destroyed, so, and then he says, are we to believe that when the very principle whereby the life is deranged and corrupted, life will be worth living so long as a man can do as he will and wills to do anything rather than to free himself from vice and wrongdoing and to win justice and virtue? So he's saying if body is so important, the soul is even more important, and taking care of your soul is the most important thing in life, whether others know about it or not. So that's what he is trying to say. Justice is the health and well-being of the soul. Just like in the city, the well-being of the city is the correct balance between those powers. In the soul, similarly, the correct power between different parts of the soul is important. So in the city, the producers are the ones who provide all the necessities. In your soul, that's the appetitive part, the one which desires food, sex, and stuff like that. On the other hand, the warriors or the auxiliaries, police, and so on, that's the spirited part of the soul, the one which strives for honor, prestige, and so on. And the reason is the one who should rule all of that. So there's a comparison between the way it works in the city and the way it works in the human soul. And justice is knowing what is the human arete, remember the word arete, virtue, and then acting accordingly. Reason rules spirit and appetites, and similarly, in just society, each individual performs his or her own natural function according to their class. Rulers rule, guardians guard, producers produce. Even though there is full social mobility, so you can actually become somebody other than who you were, but once you are who you are, you should do what you're supposed to do. Now, like I said, interestingly, towards the end, he says, but any ideal state will collapse. And this is how he describes the collapse of ideal state, which is also interesting for us. He says, first, the best state is aristocracy. Aristocracy, he doesn't mean in terms of hereditary type of aristocracy, like, the lords and the counts. Aristos, kratos in Greek just means power of the best. So the best people in charge. But then it can go into democracy. democracy. So if the spirited element takes precedent over rational part, the best form of government, intellectual aristocracy, degenerates into democracy, where honor and ambition taken over the good of the society. So even with this ideal state, when the guardians try to compete for honor and ambition, like who of them gets the most praise, right? Who of them is considered the most valuable member of the guardians? They will start then making actions which are not to everyone's benefit, but to their personal benefit. And that would be the start of the downfall. The next stage, it could go into oligarchy, which is, of course, as we all know, when the wealthy people are in power, because they could start accumulate wealth, and if they accumulate wealth and start ruling the city, that will be oligarchy. But then it can be even worse. What do you think if it was worse than oligarchy? Shockingly enough, for us at least, it is democracy. Democracy is even worse. Why is democracy worse according to Plato? Well, it is promoting anyone who merely calls himself people's friend. Remember, we talked about it when they sent this military to Sicily, and it really badly backfired. So this is the idea he has of the democracy. When majority of people rule, majority of people are producers, so they will be caring about things which are bodily pleasures. They'll be voting to give themselves tax breaks, right? So basically they will be voting for the people who promise them the most pleasures. But that's not good for the state, because obviously, if we just vote for, I don't know, constantly, like even looking at the example of this country, if we constantly vote for cutting taxes and even abolishing taxes, what then will happen? Yeah, the government needs money. They is spending money all the time. Where the money are going to come from? We already are in huge debt and it's growing. So who's going to pay in the end of the day? Guess who will pay? You guys, actually. The younger people, because you're the one who will be still there when it will all collapse. So, and then he says the next stage after that inevitably would be tyranny, because people will see that things are falling apart and they will want one strong leader who can set everything right. And that leader is supposedly going to solve the problems, when instead, of course, they will not. We only have about 1 minute left, but here's an interesting question now. Does it remind you of the situation we are in right now? And you know what he said about the tyrant, what tyrant will do next? After the democracy, there's tyranny. But what will tyrant do inevitably? He said he will start a war. That is inevitable. Tyrants always start a war because it's the best way for them to preserve power. In a war, it's like, well, we have to all unite against the enemy. Are you not one of us? Or are you supporting the enemy? And it's easy then for the tyrant to punish people who disagree with them and who try to undermine their power. Okay, I guess this is all we have for today.